Both Washington and Beijing have been trying to win over Jakarta for years, knowing that Indonesia holds the key to geopolitical power in the Indo-Pacific region. As Southeast Asia's largest economy and the world's largest archipelago, its resources and strategic importance are now catapulting it to become a major player on the global stage. Indonesia is so far staying neutral in a fierce trade war between the West and the East. The United States is offering access to its global network of trade partners, alliances, weapons, and security arrangements, with plenty of conditions attached. On the other hand, China offers partnerships with the fastest-growing state in the world, set to become the world's largest in a little over a decade. China's funding for infrastructure and industry so far has fewer conditions, though Chinese government-owned companies are already beginning to change the landscape of the Indonesian economy. Indonesia has a complicated history with the two superpowers. At different times, both have undermined Indonesia's domestic interests, with the state being used as a pawn in the Cold War. This is why Indonesia is determined not to commit to either. But growing geopolitical tensions are forcing Indonesia to make a bold foreign policy move for the first time in decades. Historically, Indonesia's biggest threat has come internally. Home to 1,300 ethnic groups, 700 languages, and more than 18,000 islands spread over 1.9 billion square kilometers, unity was considered far-fetched. Each empire has had difficulties maintaining control over such a vast and varied area. The strategic importance was clear, and the reward for taming it was immense. Indonesia is located at a posisi silang, or crossroad location. Those roads are the South China Sea, the Pacific Ocean, and the Indian Ocean. Maritime trade has been an essential part of the region's history, dating back to as early as the 4th century with Indian, Chinese, and other Asian trading partners. This vantage point gave birth to a succession of empires and was how Islam spread to the area. By the time the Dutch East India Company arrived in the late 16th century, modern-day Indonesia had already passed through many hands, all of whom understood the strategic importance of the region. The Portuguese established trading posts to secure valuable spices. It served as a major trading post. Under the Dutch, cash crops like tobacco, rubber, sugar, and opium were introduced for export. In less than 200 years, almost 5 Eros ships carrying 2.5 million tons of goods were sent through Indonesia by the Dutch East India Company. The company had collapsed by 1800, after which point the Dutch government took ownership of Indonesia, managing it as an economic outpost, which helped drive industrialization back in the Netherlands. But after World War II brought Europe to a halt, Indonesia was ready to fight back against colonialism and reclaim the industries that had enriched the First World. Indonesia declared independence in 1945, led by revolutionary Sukarno. Sukarno's vision over the next 2 decades blended anti-capitalism, nationalism, and at times martial law, in what was described as guided democracy. One of the major turning points was the nationalization of Dutch companies. In 1957, in response to regional military rebellions, Sukarno took over 246 Dutch companies. These included the Netherlands Trading Society, Eskomto Bank, and Royal Dutch Shell, which would have a huge economic impact for decades to come. Despite these attempts to produce wealth, though, Indonesia's economy was failing. Sukarno had been too preoccupied with international relations while ignoring more immediate concerns. By the 1960s, Indonesia was struggling to fight widespread poverty, hyperinflation, and deteriorating infrastructure. Sukarno was overthrown during nationwide military and paramilitary operations where at least 500,000 people were killed under the pretext of fighting communism. The military took control, and the new order that took power transformed Indonesia's society, political character, and economy. Its leader, Military General Suharto, took office in 1968 and quickly got to work. Suharto gave power to a group of economic advisors later called the Berkeley Mafia. They promoted free market capitalism by focusing on combating inflation and deregulating the market. Instead of allying with communist China as Sukarno had, Indonesia now isolated itself from the Asian giant in favor of the United States. Indonesia rejoined the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, and the World Bank, enabling financial assistance to come from Western partners. And it worked. Less than a year after the Berkeley Mafia took charge, inflation fell by over 600%. And between 1968 and 1997, there was an average economic growth rate of 6.5% per year, almost as high as China's growth between 1979 and 2010. Some of Sukarno's policies did survive, most importantly, the nationalization of major companies. Royal Dutch Shell became Permina and then Pertamina, the country's state-owned oil monopoly. By 1973, it was producing almost one-third of Indonesia's oil. And when the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, slashed its exports in 1973, there was a huge oil boom. As a member, Indonesia directly benefited from it. But underneath the economic growth was a rotten core. Funding was increasingly being misappropriated, put to both military and personal uses. And because of this, Pertamina was making huge losses, holding more than $10 billion in debt, which it eventually defaulted on. Corruption had crippled the economic reputation of the country, scaring off investment. By the mid-1990s, President Suharto was ranked by Forbes as the fourth richest person in the world, with a net worth of $16 billion, worth over $30 billion today. Rampant corruption and nepotism had been crippling the economy from functioning, and the extreme deregulation of the banking sector had allowed illegal money to pour in from overseas. The 1997 Asian financial crisis saw widespread civil unrest, the collapse of the Indonesian rupiah, and Suharto resigning from office. It would take decades for the country to recover, but what emerged combined the most effective elements of Indonesia's authoritarian and nationalistic past with democracy. The post-Suharto era saw decentralizing away from Jakarta and more power given to local governments. Responding quicker to local-level issues helped boost economic performance. This decentralization was implemented together with decreased corruption and better managed public spending. And after 2 decades of depressed prices through the 1980s and 90s, a global commodity boom lifted Indonesia's economy as a major exporter of crude oil, palm oil, coal, natural gas, and rubber. The momentum from this boom was used by the current president of Indonesia, Joko Widodo, to drive forward a grand modern vision for the country. Joko Widodo, better known as Jokowi, has served as president since 2014. He was the first candidate outside of elite or military circles to win the presidency, and has represented a new age of clean politicians. The centerpiece of his presidency has been infrastructure, which Jokowi sees as the greatest inhibitor of more rapid economic growth. Indonesia suffers from inadequate roads and ports, which are congested, clogging trade and limiting economic output. There is also a widespread lack of access to resources and common power failures throughout much of the country. Given the reliance on commodity wealth, this lack of local connectivity has made it more profitable for Indonesia to export to the global market rather than invest domestically. But this means that the country is dependent on global commodity prices, stopping Indonesia from shifting to manufacturing. But Jokowi wants to change that. Indonesia is now focusing on infrastructure, deregulation, and lowering corruption, alongside traditional goals of national unity, an agenda that has been described as a new developmentalism. Indonesia is establishing itself as a pro-business country in Southeast Asia by slashing private restrictions and streamlining business bureaucracy. Indonesia has also instituted a tax amnesty, allowing the government to identify 40% hidden assets of its GDP and get a handle on its largely untaxed economy. Political stability will be one of the most important assets for Indonesia going forward to continue to attract overseas investment. With Jokowi finishing his second and final eligible term, though, the question of future stability and succession is not an easy one. Under his presidency, Indonesia has made tactful diplomatic maneuvers which are designed to safeguard the country's interests by maintaining special relationships with international partners. But playing both sides risks souring relations with the two most powerful forces on Earth. China and the United States are both competing to win over Indonesia. It is a country seen as a vital economy to both superpowers' long-term vision. With conflicts flickering up again over the South China Sea, Taiwan, and an ongoing trade war, Indonesia will likely play a vital role in the future stability of the region. This will lead to an increased competition for their partnership from their eastern and western partners. Both have a long history with Indonesia. The United States was an early cheerleader for independence against the Dutch, hoping they could create an anti-communist ally in East Asia. There was a major diplomatic crisis in 1958 when a covert US airplane was shot down in Indonesian territory. The United States supported Sukarno's overthrow, having trained and strengthened the Indonesian military forces used to install Suharto. Washington also backed Indonesia's invasion of East Timor, knowing how important Indonesia was during the Cold War. On the other hand, Indonesia's past with China is even more complicated. While China enjoyed close relations with Indonesia during Sukarno's years, anti-Chinese sentiments made ethnic Chinese Indonesians targets during the 1965-1967 massacres, and ever since they have been viewed with suspicion by Indonesia and subject to discrimination. These climaxed again in anti-Chinese riots in 1998, where Chinese Indonesian shops were looted, vandalized, and destroyed, leading to over 1,000 deaths, signaling the end of the Suharto regime. Since then, relations between the two states have been on the mend, helped by China's position as Indonesia's #1 trading partner. However, China may be becoming too embedded within Indonesia's economy. Above all other strategic foreign policy, though, Indonesia is deeply pragmatic. Indonesia has officially committed to neutrality in the case of a United States-Chinese conflict, which America admits blunts efforts for regional power in East Asia. Instead, Indonesia has chosen to focus on bilateral economic agreements and to engage with its regional partners through organizations like ASEAN, which was set up in 1967 to organize and enable dialogue for Southeast Asian nations. ASEAN was created after the policy of confrontation with Indonesia, beginning in 1963, which was backed by the USSR and China on one side, with the Federation of Malaya, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand on the other side. At the root of the conflict was Indonesia protesting the creation of Malaysia, which would extend as far as Borneo. Indonesia believed that the new state would only serve as a puppet for the colonial British. ASEAN not only provided a channel of negotiation for Indonesia, but it also reduced the perception of them as a regional hegemon and allows them to sidestep great power politics. At the same time, ASEAN provides Indonesia with an organized power base for international partners and as a communicator of its Indo-Pacific vision. Indonesia by far holds the most sway in foreign affairs as the biggest and most powerful state in the bloc. And with Chinese expansion, Indonesia has been looking to shore up its alliances with actors in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The proposed Indo-Pacific Treaty of Cooperation and Friendship would go some way to uniting a so far disunified group of powers, made worse by the divisive issue of West Papuan independence. The Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, set up by ASEAN in 1976, covers many of the issues that the proposed Treaty of Cooperation and Friendship would cover, and includes all major parties in the region: China, Japan, Australia, and the United States. Indonesia's best option is to develop its maritime power, which the country described as its maritime nexus in 2014. But a lack of resources and management has left Indonesia's navy lagging behind its neighbors. And given the internal division of ASEAN, Indonesia's plans to project power may exceed its capabilities, though, as historically, the country's policy may be more based on a reluctance to be dragged into conflict than accumulating more power. But as a partner in China's Belt and Road Initiative, some of Indonesia's infrastructure funding is coming from the very country it seeks to protect itself from. Both China and the United States can see the untapped potential of Indonesia. With the world increasingly turning towards electric-powered vehicles, production points of essential raw materials in places like Chile and the Democratic Republic of the Congo have become highly sought after. Indonesia, too, is one of these production points. In fact, it's the world's largest producer of nickel, which is used in electric battery manufacturing. Last year, the country produced around 1 million metric tons, or more than 1/3 of global production, Much of the output is low-purity nickel used primarily in stainless steel, but Indonesia is determined to increase its quality to match demand. And similar plans to rapidly increase cobalt production would transform the country into one of the most important players in the conversion to greener energy sources. This will require a strong, organized government. Fortunately for Indonesia, one of its biggest strengths is stability, which is increasingly an attractive marketplace for international investment. Indonesia has spent decades building up a resilient mode of government, drawing on its authoritarian and nationalistic history. From Sukarno's guided democracy through Suharto's new order, Indonesia has above all else prioritized a strong, centralized government. And with falling levels of corruption, this stability has seen consistent economic growth, at a rate of around 5.5% since 2003, right up to the global pandemic. If Indonesia can maneuver its way out of its sensitive position between the United States and China, Indonesia will be on track to become the 7th largest economy in the world by 2030, offering a $1.8 trillion market opportunity. But it needs to remain cautious, not to be too dependent on foreign direct investment in pursuit of growth. It needs to climb the value-added chain and ensure its domestic firms are engaged in technologically sophisticated manufacturing. And most importantly, it needs to ensure the growth that it creates is shared relatively equally within its population in order to promote domestic tranquility in a country whose population is separated by not just the ocean, but linguistic, religious, and ethnic differences. This has been another episode of Meridian Mindset. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment down below. We also just launched a new Twitter account, so please give us a follow at Meridian Mindset and check out our other socials as well.